Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. Naila, to the Governor of the Central Bank as well for their confidence. This is a fascinating discussion for me. Of course, I will go into more details as I go forward, but I first want to just introduce myself a little bit. My name, as you see, is G Wisner. I'm a lawyer in Washington, D.C. I have been working in the Middle East and representing many governments in Washington, and I believe very much in what Mohammed Basidi said about dialogue, the importance of dialogue. I first came to Lebanon in 1968 when most of you were not alive. And I was a young man. I fell in love with Lebanon. I worked in the Shuf Mountains for your government. And it was really a formative moment for me. Of course, you remember 1968, a few of you, and it was a remarkable time. People got along. It was a very impressionable time for a young man myself. I've come back many times since and have worked with your government. I worked with the central bank. And I maintain a dialogue with the United States, all of the agencies from Treasury to the White House. And I have a few remarks to make about the new administration and how difficult or easy it is to find your way to have that dialogue. Today I'm happily married to a Syrian from Halab, so I feel like the problems of the region are in my blood now. And I have represented, during the many years I've been working, the governments of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and India and China, so I'm very experienced in how one goes about approaching Washington, D.C., and I don't want you to be at all frightened about this process. Even smaller banks can, with help and introductions both from the central bank and myself and others, will have the ability to sit down and talk about what they're going through and some of the difficulties. The Lebanese and banking communities, following the recent United States military action against Syria, the problems remain very confusing, and to understand the relationship between the United States, the new government of President Trump, must be a mystery, and my heart goes out to anybody trying to find a path, but there are paths. Between the confusion and the general unpredictability of the Trump White House and the understaffed American foreign policy apparatus, some analysts are worrying that the U.S. strike, the attack on Syria, left many questions unanswered, and there didn't seem to be a coherent strategy behind it. As you are aware, before the U.S. attack on Syria, there were positive signs that the Trump administration in particular was considering a change in its attitude toward Syria and toward the Middle East. And specifically, Ambassador Nikki Haley and our Secretary of State, Mr. Tillerson, have made public comments in the past that regime change in Syria, at least, is not important. And of course, then the attack comes, and it looks like this is a setback. Where are relationships going? I'm giving you a little bit of a political background because ultimately we believe that there is a way out of this nightmare that we're all been in. And I want to say that I believe that the dialogue begins obviously with the central bank. Riyad Salameh has a tremendous reputation in the United States as being a man of courage and vision, and is trying to find his path in the difficulties that he's presented with all of this conflict. Sanctions, and in fact the new proposed sanctions, have almost always been a total failure in history. The rise of Adolf Hitler in the Second World War was directly related to sanctions which were imposed upon the German people after the First World War, particularly by the British, who had lost many of their youth, and therefore they demanded that sanctions be kept much longer than was really possible. And of course, it embittered the German people, and then we can draw your own conclusions. The central bank, of course, has itself been forced to shutter certain Lebanese banks. Mohamed Basiri talked about that, and forced to do so after getting a terrific amount of pressure from the U.S. government. The Lebanese diaspora all over the world, you all know it well, many of you have relatives, watch all of these developments very carefully. And in fact, their remittances to Lebanon and to the banking system diminish every time these stories are told and as the problems surrounding the bank are amplified. For those of you who want to hear a little bit about this sort of the system in America, in the Obama administration, the quickest way to be delisted would be to sever your relationships with certainly any of the, let's say, Assyrian ownership or other questionable ownerships. Though their deposits and dealings are always being scrutinized by OFAC. You've heard about it before, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. It's a department of the U.S. Treasury. OFAC is under presidential national emergency powers, as well as the authority to grant specific legislation, and that's how we get into the developments in the recent months, to impose controls on transactions, as you know, and freeze assets under U.S. jurisdiction. In addition to enforcing sanctions of the U.S. law, OFAC administers sanctions based upon the United Nations and other international mandates, and works closely with allied governments and to coordinate unilateral sanctions enforcements. In addition to being an enforcement agency, OFAC conducts financial intelligence on its own. They're here, they're moving around, and they obviously work with our CIA, our FBI, as they gather information on what's happening in the Lebanese banking system. They then pass that information back to Treasury, to OFAC, and OFAC then publishes a list of specifically, specially designated persons and nationals called the SDN list, if those of you are not familiar with it. And these are organizations and people and vessels with whom the United States is prohibited from doing business. The SDN list has over 5,500 names, and it's constantly changing and being reinforced. So what does this mean for a financial institution which finds itself either with an SDN listing or the fear of being so listed? This is an interesting question, and Mohamed Basiri, I think, went right to the heart of it. The importance of reaching out, and I agree, the central bank, I think, is the first and best agent for you to send. I understand recently that a delegation is going to be sent by your government to confront the new congressional maneuvers to propose an additional increase in people who are sanctioned. These developments really, I want to explain to you, are part of a process which is in America a very political process. There is the government on one hand, and there is Congress, which is broken really into the presidency and into Congress. And Congress, of course, is made of very differing interests, which respond to political pressures put on them. And they're the ones behind this most recent series of lists. So you should understand that the president is having a very hard time with Congress today. Those of you who are reading the papers, you will see that this is not a fait accompli. This is really a matter which is in negotiation, which is again why dialogue is so important. Because at the end of the day, President Trump looks out at the Middle East and realizes that his main goal is domestic rehabilitation. My country's in a lot of trouble. Infrastructure is falling apart. We don't have the kind of resources that we've had in the past, And he does not want to own the problems of Syria, and he does not want to own the problems of Lebanon. He doesn't want to own the problems of the Middle East. He would like to see it take care of itself. Of course, some of it he passes off to international institutions, but this is a very interesting political development, because this is a man who sees his responsibility principally to America. So why is this important? America is in trouble. It needs infrastructure. It can't do it itself. This is where the banks come in. And this is why if one was to begin a dialogue, and as I'm hoping this new mission that has been sent will do with the White House, the key is to explain the importance of the Lebanese and the Syrian banking systems is in the rebuilding of the region. It cannot be done without healthy banks. It cannot be accomplished without unsanctioned banks. Now, that doesn't mean that they walk away from some of their previous positions, but we're now in a change in policy. This is going to be your problem now. Obviously, international institutions and U.S. aid and European aid will continue to flow, but make no mistake about it. If you will be behind your central bank and see that they push this message that the local banking system, an unsanctioned banking system, can rebuild, or certainly help rebuild, the Middle East, this will bring great peace and pleasure to our president. And so I think the doors are going to be open in Washington as never before to banks coming forward. It doesn't say that one doesn't admit or acknowledge some of the money laundering and other issues that are involved, but this constant reimposition of further sanctions on local banks is going to harm Lebanon's ability to look after itself. And this is I believe, a very positive message which our Bankers Association, I know, is going to be making in the next few weeks. I know that your leadership is going to do that, both your Prime Minister and your President, and I know that Riyadh, the weight of this argument will fall upon him as well. The second part of this dialogue is something you can do yourself, and I think Mohammed Basiri was saying this to you directly, and I'm not seeking work here, but American institutions can be approached by you. There are lawyers like myself, plenty of them, many of them experienced, many of them with very deep contacts with the White House. Some of them have personal relationships with the president himself. The president is, at this point, in a process of trying to build up his understanding of the region. But the State Department has lost almost a third of its employees. The Treasury Department has many offices which are not filled. So there's a real confusion from what would have been the normal apparatus to bring information about what's happening in Lebanon, which is why it's doubly important for those local banks here represented to consider going to Washington and having a dialogue and cleaning the slate. Congress, the pressure behind these latest reforms, or the new names on the SDN list, I should say, is many times very political. And I won't get into all of the politics because you can imagine how sensitive it is. But this is not a fait accompli. This is something that can be turned back, because in many, many ways we're juggling all sorts of interests. But if good Lebanese banks go to Washington, and you don't have to go if you're uncomfortable going with a member of the Bankers Association or putting all that responsibility on Riyadh's shoulders, then do so yourselves. And I can tell you, there are those of us who have that access. This is what we do for a living, and we can have you sit down with the Treasury Department, we can have you sit down with the OFAC, and we can explain the pressures on you and clear your record. For those of you who would like to engage the services of an accounting company, an American accounting company would be particularly useful, not because I want to give them business, but because many times their assurances that your books are clean and they've looked at your customers and they're clean would give great credibility in terms of being able to return this. So remember, because a bill is proposed in Congress doesn't make it law. And it still has a lot of very difficult roads to climb. And I certainly believe that our president, and he's an extremely bright man, but the problems are enormous and beyond our capacity to solve them. So I would strongly recommend that you consider seriously, if those of you find yourselves that you're either not satisfied with what the central bank is doing, and I, frankly, I think, or the Bankers Association, I think these are the first forays of influence that Americans will listen to. Remember, we can't fix the region. Your banks can. You understand the economy. You understand the imperfections in your economies. And for me, this is, I think, a very strong argument that needs to be made over and over again. If you want to solve the problems in the Middle East, don't then handicap every bank. There may be banks that, for a variety of reasons that I won't go into now, this will not be a good strategy. But for the most part, and I would say 99%, this is the right way to go. Don't be threatened by Washington. It's expensive to get on an airplane, but really you need one person and a ticket and a dossier, and then you get access and you sit down and you go over what has happened to your banks. The world is changing quickly. I don't have any monopoly. I can't properly understand all the maneuvers of my government, sadly, or even President Trump, but he's in a learning curve right now, and it's enormous. And so I say those of us who've had experience in Lebanon would be delighted to help and walk you to the White House or to the Treasury Department or to the Commerce Department, to OFAC, to FinCEN. These are all the organizations which will be making these evaluations. And I think you can be delisted. You can make applications to be delisted. You can hire various people who can look into your background beyond the accounting companies. We employ in my law firm a group of ex-intelligence officers that can look into the backgrounds of people. Again, this is not an expensive process, but it may be a way for you to have your own dialogue. I've heard this kind of desire from those of us here today to do something beyond what the central bank can do. I have confidence in the central bank. I have confidence in Riyad Salameh. But I understand that you all may be impatient on your own account, so I say to you, don't be intimidated by America. Come to us, and we'll take a look at your dossiers and try to understand it. And I would certainly give you help, but there are many others who will also help you in this process. America's full of allies, not only in the Lebanese community. There are very prominent Americans who are close friends of President Trump, and they would also be interested in this approach. So take heart. The storm is not necessarily coming. We're a long ways from getting this bill enacted. It may happen, it may not happen. There are political pressures, but I think if the president understands, to say this one last time, that the rebuilding of the region is critical and to have a healthy, strong, and unfettered banking system. And so come and let him hear it. Thank you.